What do we experience at the edge of death? Sound, vibration, and the architecture of consciousness. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I want to begin with a question that many avoid, not because it is abstract, but because it is intimate. What does a human being experience after death? More precisely, if the body falls silent, does experience vanish? Or does something remain something like a sound, a vibration, a field of awareness trembling within itself? This is not a theological curiosity. It is a phenomenological and neuroscientific question. It concerns the structure of consciousness itself. An ancient Tibetan text, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, approaches this question with astonishing precision. It does not treat death merely as a spiritual event. It describes it as a systematic deconstruction of sensory architecture. And tonight, I will not ask you to believe anything. Instead, I invite you to examine a possibility. How might we understand death not as mythology, but as a shift in perceptual structure? Death as the dissolution of sensory layers. According to this text, death is not simply the cessation of biological function. It is a progressive dismantling of perception. First, vision collapses. The eyes may remain open, but form can no longer be discriminated. Second, hearing changes. External sounds fade, while an internal resonance becomes more pronounced. Third, bodily sensation dissolves. Weight, temperature, boundary all lose coherence. Fourth, cognition itself begins to fragment. Language, narrative, logical sequencing, these structures disintegrate. And then, at what the text describes as the final threshold, something appears. Not a sound in the ordinary sense, not a voice, not an acoustic event, but what it calls a vibration, or sometimes a radiant luminosity. Why vibration instead of sound? Because sound, as we understand it, is air pressure oscillation detected by the ear. But if the ear no longer functions, what remains to perceive anything? The radical claim is this: consciousness perceived directly without sensory organs. In other words, what is experienced is not external sound, but the reverberation of awareness encountering itself. If you have ever been deep in a dream where no physical sound exists, yet something feels like it is ringing, you have touched a faint analogy. Fear or liberation. Here is where the text becomes psychologically sophisticated. This internal vibration is not inherently terrifying or blissful. Its meaning depends entirely on how it is recognized. For an unprepared consciousness, the experience is overwhelming, disorienting, frightening, destabilizing. For a trained consciousness, it is described as the doorway to liberation. The text repeatedly addresses the dying with a single instruction: do not be afraid. This is not an external enemy. It is the light of your own mind. Notice the psychological insight here. The terror is not caused by the phenomenon itself, but by unfamiliarity, which raises a critical question. Is this vibration something utterly inaccessible during life? Or can we approach it, however partially, through meditation? Sensory deprivation, or extreme silence. Meditation and the limits of perception. Let us be precise. Ordinary meditation typically remains anchored in three domains: awareness of breath, observation of bodily sensation, witnessing of thoughts. As long as these remain, consciousness is still tethered to the body. The vibration described in the Tibetan text is said to emerge only when that tether dissolves completely. So does meditation reproduce death? No. Meditation does not simulate death. What it does is cultivate the stability required not to panic when perception destabilizes. Imagine walking from daylight into a pitch-dark room. If a floodlight suddenly activates, your eyes ache. But if your vision has slowly adjusted to darkness, you can discern even subtle elimination. Meditation is not about generating the light. It is about preparing the perceptual system to endure it. Silence experiments and the amplification of the inner field. Consider modern sensory deprivation experiments. When individuals are placed in fully soundproof chambers, they do not experience peaceful silence for long. Instead, they report, "I can hear my heartbeat. My blood sounds loud. There's a ringing in my head. It feels like the room is vibrating." Why? Because when external stimuli disappear, the brain does not shut down. It amplifies internal signals. In neuroscience, this reflects predictive processing under conditions of sensory deprivation. The brain, deprived of input, increases gain on endogenous signals. But note the difference. In a soundproof chamber, the ego remains intact. The person still says, "I am hearing this." In the death process described in the Tibetan text, the ego boundary collapses. There is no stable narrator left to interpret the vibration. That is why the same structural phenomenon can manifest as terror or as release. Frequency experiments and the illusion of reality. Consider another simple experiment. A high-frequency tone is played in a room. A 20-year-old hears it. A 55-year-old does not. Same room, same air, same sound wave, but perception differs. What does this reveal? That existence and recognition are not identical. Something may be present, yet remain outside your perceptual bandwidth. As we age, auditory hair cells degrade, particularly those detecting high frequencies. But more subtly, the brain filters out signals it deems irrelevant. In effect, our reality is a narrow band, selected by biological and cognitive constraints. The Tibetan text suggests that death exposes layers of experience that were always present but filtered out. The vibration after death is not newly created, it is newly unfiltered. The universe as field, not silence. Modern physics tells us something remarkable. The universe is not silent. It is saturated with electromagnetic radiation, cosmic background radiation, plasma oscillations, solar wind fluctuations. But we do not perceive these directly. We require instruments. Similarly, the Tibetan tradition describes reality not as inert emptiness, but as a field, a continuous, dynamic presence. There is an intriguing structural parallel here. Cosmic radiation is measurable energy oscillation. The vibration described in contemplative literature is experiential oscillation of awareness. They are not physically identical, but structurally both share three properties. They are always present. They remain unnoticed without appropriate receptive structures. They become meaningful only when something is capable of registering them. Death, in this framework, is not hearing cosmic waves. It is consciousness encountering itself as field. Why monasteries are in the mountains. Many assume monasteries were built in remote mountains simply because they are quiet. That is only partially true. Cities are not merely noisy in the acoustic sense. They are saturated with meaning, noise, advertisements, roles, social comparison, deadlines, language, identity reinforcement. Mountain environments reduce not only sound, but interpretive demand. Wind does not require judgment. Birdsong does not demand response. Water does not negotiate status. This progressive simplification weakens the reflexive structure of the ego. Monastic space is not a relaxation retreat. It is an architectural design intended to reduce identity reinforcement. In a subtle way, it mirrors certain conditions associated with dying. Reduction of social identity, weakening of time orientation, repetition of ritual rhythm, sensory simplification. It is a rehearsal not of death itself, but of letting go. Can we experience the final vibration while alive? The decisive question is this: can a living person experience the exact vibration described at death? The classical answer is careful. Meditation does not reproduce death, but it can prepare consciousness to recognize what would otherwise be overwhelming. For the vibration is not described as something alien. It is described as something intimately familiar, so familiar that we overlook it. The instruction given to the dying is not discover something new. It is, do not recoil. What appears now has always been your own ground. Perhaps the deepest insight is this: we assume silence is the absence of sound. We assume death is the absence of experience. We assume reality is limited to what our senses report. But what if silence is saturated with unrecognized resonance? What if death reveals not emptiness, but structure? What if consciousness is less like a solid object and more like a field that trembles when unshielded? The question is no longer religious. It is architectural. What is the structure of awareness when its scaffolding falls away? And are we prepared not to believe, but to remain steady when that trembling begins? Last language of consciousness. Death, vibration, and the architecture of awareness. Let us begin where we left off. We have examined sound, silence, meditation, sensory deprivation, frequency experiments, and even cosmic radiation. Each path led us toward a single question. What is the vibration the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes at the moment after death? To answer that, we must now shift from scattered observations to a unified framework. The so-called vibration is not a sensory event. It is not something heard by the ears, seen by the eyes, or felt through the skin. It belongs to a deeper register. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this vibration arises at the level of consciousness prior to sensory processing. It appears when awareness encounters itself directly, without mediation, without object, without narrative. This is why the text describes it in paradoxical language. It is not audible, yet it resounds. It has no form, yet it is unmistakable. It does not come from outside, but from nowhere other than oneself. It cannot be avoided, but if recognized, it is not frightening. Here we must be precise. The vibration is only metaphorically similar to sound or electromagnetic waves. Structurally, however, it belongs to a different ontological category. Sound requires air. Waves require measurable energy. The vibration described in this text requires only awareness. Why then do we not perceive this vibration while alive? The answer cuts through everything we have discussed. Because living consciousness is object-oriented. We look at something, we listen to something, we think about something, we react to something. Consciousness in ordinary life is almost never without an object. But the vibration described here appears only when awareness stands without an object, when there is nothing left to perceive except itself. That state rarely occurs in ordinary life. Survival constantly pushes attention outward. This clarifies something essential. Meditation does not create this vibration. Silence does not generate it. Mountain monasteries do not summon it. All of these practices do one thing only. They gradually weaken consciousness's habit of running toward objects. In rare moments, very rare awareness approaches objectless presence. When that happens, practitioners report experiences such as a hum without sound, a resonance in space itself, a sense that existence is trembling. But we must be careful this is not yet the full post-death vibration. It is a threshold phenomenon. Now let us widen the lens. In much of Western thought, death is framed as annihilation, the end, the termination of the self, an abyss of non-being. But in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, death is described differently. It is the most radical, pedagogical moment. Why? Because for the first time, consciousness exists without sensory input, social identity, narrative continuity, temporal orientation. In that state, what remains? The vibration. It is not speech. It is not image. It is not concept. It is awareness recognizing itself directly. This is what the text calls light. Now the question becomes sharper. If the vibration is the same for all beings, why do experiences differ so dramatically? Why do some experience terror while others experience liberation? The text's answer is uncompromising. The vibration does not change. What changes is interpretation. Consciousness that has known itself only as story and memory will experience the dissolution of story as annihilation. Consciousness that has practiced resting without narrative will experience the same dissolution as homecoming. The difference lies in conditioning. The fearful consciousness typically shows these traits. Identity built entirely on biography. Constant reactivity to stimuli. Intolerance for silence. Anxiety in the face of loss of control. For such a mind, the vibration feels like erasure. I am disappearing. I am losing control. I am being overwhelmed. Thus the text says, the being flees from the light and seeks the familiar darkness. That darkness is not punishment. It is the reflex to return to form, what the tradition calls rebirth. Rebirth in this framework is not judgment. It is reflexive retreat. When the vibration cannot be endured, consciousness searches for shape, story, relationship, identity. It gravitates toward what feels familiar. On the other hand, there exists a different kind of consciousness, one that has even briefly experienced itself prior to narrative, one that has practiced remaining in silence, one that understands that letting go is not destruction. For such a mind, the vibration is recognized. Oh, this was always here. This is not foreign. Thus, the same phenomenon becomes liberation. This brings us to the practical dimension. Why is this ancient teaching relevant to modern people? Because modern life amplifies noise to unprecedented levels. Information saturation, identity performance, perpetual stimulation, endless internal commentary. In such conditions, death becomes terrifying, not because it is near, but because we have never practiced being without interface. Here is a useful metaphor for a contemporary audience. Death is not system shutdown. It is interface removal. When the interface disappears, consciousness connects directly to itself. If that connection is interpreted as error, fear arises. If it is recognized as home screen, freedom appears. Now we arrive at the ethical dimension. Why does the text speak about honesty, compassion, and simplicity when discussing death? Because ethics here is not moral policing. It is cognitive simplification. The more fragmented our inner life, the more difficult it becomes to remain steady when narrative collapses. Consider 3 factors. First, dishonesty multiplies internal narratives. Every deception creates parallel realities that must be maintained. At death, those layered stories surface as turbulence. Second, resentment binds consciousness to the past. Unresolved grievances function as anchors. When confronted with objectless awareness, such anchors pull the mind back toward form. Third, attachment fixes identity to specific configurations. If I believe without this role, I am nothing, then dissolution of that role will feel catastrophic. Thus, compassion and honesty are not spiritual decorations. They reduce cognitive weight. They make consciousness lighter. The lighter consciousness becomes, the less it needs to flee. Preparation for death, then, is not about mystical experiences. It is about learning 3 things in daily life. Pause before reacting. Do not treat silence as failure. Practice releasing control in small moments. A delayed response in anger. Remaining present in an awkward silence. Accepting an outcome you cannot control. These are micro-rehearsals. The text's message can be distilled into several propositions. The vibration after death is not newly created. It has always been present. We avoid it through constant engagement. Meditation does not produce it. It trains stability before it. Rebirth is reflex, not punishment. Liberation is sustained recognition. What ultimately do human beings fear? Not death itself, but standing without distraction before themselves. So we speak endlessly. We scroll. We perform. We interpret. Yet the text suggests when there is nowhere left to flee, the original light appears. Life, then, is rehearsal. Meditation is not acquisition of special states. It is strengthening awareness so it does not collapse in silence. Death does not ask whether we are ready. It reveals the structure we have built. If even one person pauses today, just briefly, to notice the background hum beneath their roles and narratives, then this reflection has served its purpose. If this exploration has been meaningful to you, consider subscribing and sharing, not as a gesture of agreement, but as an invitation for others to approach life and death with deeper clarity. Awareness grows steadier when examined together. Thank you for your attention.